Cypher here. You might see the title and go, why is he talking about this movie? Trust me, I didn't plan to, hence why this is a mini episode. As many of you have pointed out, horror movies often claim to be based on a true story. I don't touch them because that claim is typically just as stupid as it would appear to be. It's pure marketing. The Witch, on the other hand, is something incredibly different. It says this at the end to be clear, but they don't need to say that, at least to someone like me. Those things are more for the people who get so enraptured in a film that they drop all criticality. As a historian, I can't do that so readily. And something really pricked my ears up when watching this one. The story is a fairly simple one, although it's a horror movie with supernatural elements, and I'm not going to ruin anything with spoiler talk here. The premise is of a family living in 17th century New England after being exiled by a Puritan colony because of the father's heretical preaching.
Then take your leave and trouble us no further.
So they live out in the wilderness. But the woods are inhabited by a great evil that takes the children and drives the family apart through their Christianity. I'm not going to spoil anything, but inexorably, this becomes a going native story in just the right kind of horrific way. So why do I care about this? It's a horror movie with supernatural elements. Why would a historian care? Well, because this actually shows us something about American history in a surprising and unique way. And it finally gives me a chance to talk about these books. Somebody's been reading their Slotkin to make this movie. The basis of this movie is to give a very accurate depiction of the American myth. And Richard Slotkin here is by far the best historian to talk about this kind of myth. But first I have to talk about what the American myth is, at least in Slotkin's perception. He wrote this trilogy of books specifically about the American mythos. This one is the beginning, then The Fatal Environment, then Gunfighter Nation. If you want to read these things, I highly recommend just starting with the third one in the trilogy because it's the most legible, but you gotta be really motivated because this guy is not exactly easy to read. So as the title of the first book would imply, he says, the first colonists saw in America an opportunity to regenerate their fortunes, their spirits, and the power of their church and nation. But the means to that regeneration ultimately became the means of violence, and the myth of regeneration through violence became the structuring metaphor of the American experience. So that is pretty complicated, so let me simplify about 2,000 pages really quickly. The basic idea of the frontier myth is that somebody goes out into the wilderness and conquers it, often saving a captive in the process. Throughout all of this person becomes part of the wilderness and regenerates civilization through his adventures. You have a hunter saving a captive. That captive represents the thing that has to be remade, as in civilization itself. If you've ever watched a Western movie, this is the fundamental idea. They go out and fight some Indians, save the girl, and eventually the frontiersman has to go back into the frontier from which he has become a part of, while the captives remain sitting by, as in when John Wayne has the door closed on him. This is the fundamental American myth in Slotkin's view. The U.S. regenerated itself through fighting, through violence. Civilization became anew through this violence. So what does that have to do with the basis of the film? Why is regeneration through violence something that this film talks about? Well, because many early Puritan narratives about captivity amongst Indians or in just the wilderness having to survive often portrayed nature itself as evil, as in going away from the Puritan settlements was evil. If one went beyond the pale of civilization and joined the savages, then they would become one and enter their world of sin. And this entire movie is about that. Even though it doesn't show Indians per se, it does show witches who could be interpreted as that evil wilderness. It is unique to the American mythos, and it was the beginning of the development of our myth. For eventually, we came up with narratives about conquering that evil, especially with things like leather stockings a century later, which, by the way, is the basis of The Last of the Mohicans. But these are quintessentially mythological. They are purposefully creating a myth to reinforce a particular moral. That moral eventually develops into regeneration through violence. So we still have this kind of thing built into our mythos, and that's why this movie works so well. There's something buried deep in the stories that we always tell each other that this movie plays off of. The existential horror that it inhabits is something that we very much have built into our mythos. I also rather love it because it's not built on jump scares and whatnot. It's very much existential horror. And it is extremely accurate to at least the way that Slotkin portrays these myths. But I know some of you want me to at least enumerate some of the inaccuracies, but really there isn't much to go on because, well, it's showing off some supernatural events. You know, people floating and witchcraft and wizardry. So the inaccuracies to, physical phenomena don't really matter here. It is accurate to American myths. And that is pretty dang hard to pull off. This movie matters in a way that I had to make this episode just to say. But, if you're not into studying American mythology or American violence, then it might not be for you, or if you don't like horror. But I will say that it gives you a sense of that early myth, that existential horror about going into the wilderness and being affected by the sin of the savages. Oh, and one last thing. This book right here begins with Frederick Jackson Turner as a myth maker, so love this stuff. But Slotkin is also very hard to read, so unless you really are motivated, just take my word for it. And beware the witches in the woods. They're coming for your children. Nope. These are thick books, Jesus. I mean, seriously, thick freaking books. Nope. Come on. There we go. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Okay. God, I suck at this.